policies. And as I mentioned, we'll borrow a lot from what Steve was presenting on WHO FCTC. Steve talked about why tobacco control matters. I talked about the number of smokers in Africa, but it can't compare with the other countries, that is in the European countries or in the Americas. If you ever had a chance to travel outside Africa, you'll discover that a lot of people smoke. Especially, I mean, the streets of London, the streets of Manchester are just smelling tobacco or cigarettes. So you realize that sub-Saharan Africa, while there are 80 million smokers, that is just a fraction of what of the number of smokers in other continents or other regions. And tobacco companies, we have stated this, is targeting Africa because of the weak regulatory systems. Is targeting Africa because Africa is a young continent with a median age of 19. And there's a strong evidence-based that evidence-based policies are essential to counteract this trend of tobacco companies now moving their operations to Africa, or rather their production. So evidence is needed to control that. The role of scientific evidence to combat tobacco industry interference. Tobacco industry interference, we didn't define it, but loosely can be defined as activities by the tobacco industry that either undermine public health or flout policies or are done subtly to recruit young people and bring in or recruit new smokers or new users. The types of tobacco control policies, and Steve also tried to talk about this, the demand side policies, and then there's the supply side or the supply side policies. The demand side policies, and these are things that you've seen, the smoke-free environments. If you go to, for instance, government buildings or even private buildings, you'll see a signage or rather a warning that this is smoke-free zone, or you can't smoke here. Or you'll find there are places where if you want to smoke, you go smoke there. There's one in Jivanji, for those who have been to Jivanji. They're spread across Nairobi. Those are demand-side policies. The reason why they're called demand-side policies is that they discourage people from smoking. And then there's the health warnings. If you look at tobacco packaging, you'll find there's health warning there that tobacco use kills or smoking kills. And in fact, the new health warnings require that about 70% of the packaging is just the health warnings. 70%, just the health warnings. And there's also the taxation. The taxation are on the tobacco products are taxed under what we call the excise duty or excise tax. Excise tax means, or is also called sin tax. Sin tax means you are paying a tax for the anomalies you've created or for your sins. That's why they're called sin tax. So the sin tax or the excise duties are part or the demand side policies, because what do? The argument here is that when you increase taxes on tobacco products, then it means tobacco companies will also have to increase the price of that product. But sometimes these companies do swallow these taxes so that the prices remains relatively stable. And that's why, as tobacco control advocates, we push the government to increase taxes so that you are able to discourage people from smoking. How does it discourage people from smoking? It ensures that these products are able to are expensive, especially for populations that are price sensitive. Populations that are price sensitive include young people, because an increase or a marginal increase of even about 10% will dissuade or discourage young people from using that product. So it helps young people, but it also helps low income populations because they are price sensitive. The rich and the wealthy are not really price sensitive because for them they will just buy at whatever price. So taxation actually is beneficial as a policy to young people and low income population because they are price sensitive. Education and cessation support. The uh, Tobacco Control Act, which we're going to talk about in a few, provides for education and cessation support. Talking to people, rather sensitizing them on the deleterious effects of tobacco or tobacco products. And cessation support, that is, how do they gradually stop using those products? Someone will argue that maybe the use of e-cigarettes are part of the cessation support that is being pushed by the industry, but we know very well they are also doing this just to switch addiction. That's why it's very contentious, as I mentioned. Marketing bans is also a policy. You will not see tobacco being advertised on billboard. You will not see them being advertised on TV, even during watershed hours. You will not see them being advertised, or they put what do we call it? A banner outside marketing tobacco. But they have become so innovative, so they utilize things as social media. On the supply side of policies, there is the ban on sales to and by minors. There is the illicit trade control and livelihood alternatives for farmers. Livelihood alternative for farmers has been tried by the WHO. It has been implemented in Migori, where they tried the livelihood alternative livelihoods. And what does this mean? It means that those who are once growers of tobacco leaves, or rather growing tobacco, can now grow other viable cash crop like beans. They can grow other products like they can even grow sugarcane, like an alternative to tobacco. So that's why they're called livelihood alternatives, because some are saying they do this for their as a source of livelihood. So you support them. Those are the policies on the supply side. The WHO FCTC has been talked about, and so I don't need to spend time over there. I just need to talk about the Empower, which is the best buy for WHO, best buy in the WHO FCTC. Empower means you monitor tobacco use and prevention, protect people from smoke. So you'll find that this Empower policy actually covers everything I've talked about in the previous slide. You monitor tobacco use and prevention. You protect people from smoke, that is, implement smoke-free environment. You offer help to quit, the cessation support I was talking about, warn people about the dangers, that is the education, enforce ad bans, that is marketing bans, and raise tobacco taxes, that is the tax, coming up with new tax regimes to ensure that you introduce new taxes to tobacco product. But when we were at ATIM, we were introduced to something called Endgame, or Professor Lekan Ayo, who is the director for ATIM, introduced us to this thing. And I just thought of just adding it into this one. That is E before the M. That is Empower. So E is the endgame thinking. encouraging policymakers to think about the elimination of tobacco use altogether, not just control, eradication as a long-term goal. And this has been implemented. If we look at what New Zealand is doing with the smoke-free generation, they are having that end game thinking. And so that one is an addition to the Empower, which make it more, what do I call it? Make it more robust. Now, Empower in Africa, the varying levels of adoption across Africa or across different countries. If you look at how countries are monitoring tobacco use, there are varying levels. Kenya is doing a lot or doing great in terms of implementing Empower. And in terms of tax policies, Botswana is a best, what do you call it? Is a benchmark for African countries. But there's still gaps in enforcement and monitoring. Of course, we find that the tobacco industry is still having a field ride. And sometimes we also find government officials are still working in cahoots with the tobacco industry officials. You can recall in 2021 when the CS, not 2021, it was 2023, I suppose, when the CS courier met with the the managing director for BAT, who is Crispin Achola, in a boardroom, while FCTC Article 5.3 dictates that when such meetings happen, they must happen in public. That is a clear violation of FCTC. Recently, a letter purportedly came from the Ministry of Health, signed by Mary Muthoni, who's the PS for Public Health and Professional Standards. And when we raised this issue, the silence was just deafening. That is the challenges those are the challenges we are facing. And so, welcome to this tobacco control space where you will meet very interesting stuff. Kenya's Tobacco Control Policy Framework, we have an act, that is the Tobacco Control Act 2007. Remember, this act is currently being amended. Why is it being amended? To include, what do we call them? Emerging tobacco products, and ensure that they have health warnings in vapes, that's the new product, the nicotine pouches. So there's currently a bill in Parliament. It's called the Tobacco Control Amendment Bill 2024. You can check online, you'll find that. Now, Tobacco Control Regulations 2014 is what gives Tobacco Control Act the legal mandate. Remember, Tobacco Control Act was enacted in 2007, but it could not do anything until 2014. First, BAT challenged that before Kenya can utilize this act in tobacco control, first there must be accompanying regulations. Now, what happened is that it took 7 years before Kenya could get now the tobacco control regulations. Interesting thing happened again after the 2014 tobacco control regulations were enacted. BAT again went to court challenging tobacco control regulations. High Court ruled in 2016. They took it to the Court of Appeal. Then they took it to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court finally in 2019 said that the government of Kenya acted not in contravention of the FCTC as they claimed by enacting these tobacco control regulations. So it took 13 good years for Kenya to have tobacco control laws that could be enforced. They were not enforceable until 2019. Of course, there were things that were being done, but they lacked the legal mandate. Now, national policy innovations. Of course, there are things that have been done, like the plain packaging. The there's a classical case from Australia, because Australia had been taken to court to the World Trade Organization for implementing plain packaging. I don't know whether it's BAT or Philip Morris that took Australia to court, and Australia finally won the case by demanding plain packaging. Plain packaging means you don't have to put fancy stuff on the packaging. Let the packaging be plain. The argument is that when the packaging is plain, it's not appealing to young people, and you can dismiss it and not buy that product. But when the packaging looks fancy, like right now they're doing with nicotine pouches and the e-cigarettes, they are attractive to young people, and that will encourage use of those products. The ban on single stick cigarette sales, I've been seeing that happening even here where I live, where single sticks of cigarettes are still being sold, while the law is very clear in terms of you should not sell single sticks. If somebody wants to buy cigarette, they should buy the whole package. What does that mean? It's easier for somebody to forgo a cigarette if they are to buy the whole package, if it is, say, 200 or 250 or even 1,000. But now that they can buy single stick, which is just 20 bob, then that is encouraging the use of these tobacco products. Then there's also licensing for retailers in the track, and the track and trace system, which actually Kenya has been lauded for this effort in doing what? On tracking and tracing illicit trade. That is illicit tobacco or illicit tobacco products. So Kenya has really done well. And if you look at the WHO literature, you'll find Kenya being commended on that track and trace system. Lastly, what's working in practice? Of course, public awareness has increased even in Kenya. Cessation support services have been expanded. Enforcement of smoke-free areas are improving, and you've seen that. If you go to Nairobi, you will see these warnings everywhere, especially in public buildings. Some success with cross-border collaboration in illicit trade. In fact, this is the track and trace system that I'm talking about. Then the Tobacco Control Fund, taxes, otherwise known as the Solatium Fund. The Solatium Fund is actually a compensation for the tobacco harms by the tobacco industry or caused by these tobacco products. So the Solatium Fund is actually supposed to be used for public health programs. Right now, there's a lot of cries here that the ministry is sitting on the Solatium Fund and is not releasing them to even the CSOs to utilize that money for public health programs. Persistent gaps and challenges still exist. Of course, the hue and cry is still on weak enforcement in rural areas where nobody is checking what is happening. And that's why the sale of single cigarettes or single sticks still happen in the rural area as it happens in the urban areas. Inconsistent taxation policies, like this time it's the different types of taxes, by the way. There's the ad valorem taxes, which are not uniform. Then there's the single or unified tax systems. So the inconsistent tax policies or taxation policies, that this year there's this tax, the next year they lower the taxes, that is still persistent. Then the industry interference and legal pushback. As I've mentioned, remember BAT took Kenya to court, or the Kenyan government to court, and for 14 years dragged the Kenyan government to court. And that means there was loss of public fund as Kenya was arguing their case in the courts. And there was also the time that was lost and the human resources. Then the limited funding for public health campaign. Of course, the Solution Fund is not enough. And I don't think funding will ever be enough anyways. So these are challenges that are there. Way forward, we must strengthen and enforce existing laws. We must promote cross-sectoral collaboration, increase public health funding, target youth prevention, and that's why the work that we're doing is just to dissuade young people from doing that. Leveraging digital advocacy, what we are doing online, and some of you can attest to that work we are doing, or to the work we are doing on the online platform, especially on LinkedIn, on X, and even on Facebook. I've seen Dindi, you've been consistent, and that is great. Then we must institutionalize empower thinking. That is with the end game thinking. In conclusion, Africa is making progress in terms of the because right now there are a lot of tobacco control movements in Africa. There are a lot of tobacco control movements in Africa, but there are a lot of work that's still going to be done. Of course, evidence-based policies do work, whether they're the demand side policies or the supply side policies. And we must stay vigilant, collaborate, we must innovate and push for the tobacco end game. I think as I end is just to mention that let us build tobacco-free generation, which is the end game thinking. We are done there. Steve, I'll get it to you, and maybe if you have anything you want to mention, or we take questions. How do we go?